why we care about it, which is concepts like global warming. There
have been a report of an emergency.
And now the conclusion.
Well, usually I like to film these at school because it's a nice quiet environment, but maybe I should revisit that a little bit. Where was I? So I think I was talking about how the chemistry of carbon and understanding the carbon cycle is important to actually know because of things like global warming in the world, which we will talk about for like months and months later on in this course. But that is the scientific kind of backdrop for that issue. All right, so let's move on to nitrogen and figure out what's going on with nitrogen and the nitrogen cycle. So kind of similar to the carbon cycle, we'll start with the atmosphere. And actually, this is where a lot of nitrogen is in the world. Most of the atmosphere is nitrogen. About 80% of the atmosphere is nitrogen. And in your body, nitrogen is what makes protein. Your proteins are made of something called amino acids. Amino refers to ammonia, and you'll actually notice this amino group here, which is nitrogen and hydrogen, is pretty similar to ammonia, which is NH3. This is NH2, so it's kind of been broken apart and tagged on to this other stuff, and that's what makes an amino acid, and that is the building block of all protein in your body. So you have nitrogen in your body, and it's all pretty much in the form of protein and amino acids. Where does the protein in your body come from? I think that you kind of obviously know. It's from your food. You got to go eat your steak, or you drink your milk, or eat your tofu, or whatever it is that you're eating to get your protein. But that is where our protein in our body comes from, is from eating various products, either other plants or animals. That's what we're getting our nitrogen from. Plants have to make their proteins. They're not eating anything. They're having to make their proteins out of soil. So the nitrogen that happens to be in the soil. Okay. Of course, there are always some exceptions to this. This is the Venus flytrap, a famous plant that actually will eat insects and will kind of lure them in and then trap them and consume them slowly over time. And the reason it does this is because it lives in an environment where there is very, very little nitrogen in the soil, and so it has to get its nitrogen from eating animals. So kind of a reverse of the normal. Anyway, this all kind of begs the question, if nitrogen is so common in the air, I mean, it's all around you. Every breath you're taking right now is mostly nitrogen. Why do we have to go through this convoluted process to get protein in our bodies? Why can't we just make protein out of the air? Wouldn't that be pretty sweet? Why do we have to go through plants, and then plants have to get it from the soil, and then how does it get into the soil? Why is that all happening? And the answer is, it's really hard to take atmospheric nitrogen and make it into pretty much anything else. And the only creature on Earth that actually can use atmospheric nitrogen and make it into something else happens to be bacteria. So how nitrogen typically gets from the air to soil or from the air to water is through bacteria. Bacteria are these microscopic little creatures. You can't see them with your eye. You have to have a microscope to see them. And when you have a microscope, this is kind of what they look like on the right. They're these little peanut-looking creatures, for lack of a better word. That's kind of their shape, typically. And they are just kind of everywhere on pretty much every surface doing their thing. And there are certain kinds of bacteria that can actually take nitrogen from the air and turn it into something called ammonia. I'm not going to put the chemical equation up here, but the general gist is that atmospheric nitrogen is something called N2, or diatomic nitrogen. And it's a whole lot of chemistry that I don't necessarily want to get into, but the gist is that these two atoms of nitrogen are triple bonded. And what that means, for lack of a better word, is that it's a very, very strong interaction. To actually do something with this nitrogen, you have to break this triple bond, and that takes a lot of energy and is generally not worthwhile for most creatures to do, except for this one type of bacteria that can do it. And basically, once this bacteria can do it and kind of can die and get into the soil, that's where soil gets its nitrogen, usually in the form of ammonia, and then plants can take that ammonia up and make protein. There might be some environmental scientists out there freaking out that I am skipping over some of these like secondary reactions. You can go from ammonia to things like nitrates and nitrites and all this other stuff, and that's what the plants are using. And yes, there's a whole nother slew of bacteria that do that. For the most part, I think that's overkill. The idea is that the nitrogen needs to move from the air to the soil. That process is called nitrogen fixation, and it's done by bacteria. Let's leave it at that. All right, somewhere else we find nitrogen in the world, and again, we're going to connect all this stuff together for our nitrogen cycle, but there is also nitrogen in animal waste. So the nitrogen that gets into your body, it's not like, yes, you eat protein and you build muscle, but it's not like you just gain muscle constantly your entire lifetime. You just get more and more swole as you get older and older. Obviously, some of this nitrogen must be leaving our bodies, and it's leaving in the form of pee and poo. Very technical terms that we're going to use for this class. We can call it animal waste if we want to get fancy. And the idea is that muscles and things over time will break down, and some of these amino acids will kind of fall apart, and we need to get rid of all that waste, and that is basically the main function of our urine and our feces, is to get rid of that stuff. It's also indicative, if you've ever planted plants in a garden before and used something called mulch, which is that brown stuff that you sprinkle on top of them, you'll notice that it smells really, really terrible. It smells like poop. That's because it is poop. There's poop in it. That that's because that poop is nitrogen that, when it works its way into the soil, can be used by the plants. So plants can literally use your poop and build new protein out of it. I don't have it set up this year, but usually this is also a time where I do another demo where I have a fish tank in my classroom, and there is a hydroponic system rigged up, which means that the water from the fish tank is pumped out onto plants, and then it kind of percolates back into the fish tank. And all of the poop from the fish that is in the water gets put through the plants, and the plants can use it to grow, and then it cleans the water as it moves back in the fish tank. Pretty neat idea. But I usually grow things like herbs and vegetables in my hydroponic system, and then I will eat those herbs and vegetables in the classroom. And what I'm eating is the same atoms as fish poop. I mean, that's where it came from. And that usually grosses everybody out. So I'm sorry that I can't, I can just describe it to you, but, and I hate to break it to you, but pretty much anytime you're eating anything, those nitrogen atoms, decent chance, depending on what kind of fertilizers were used to grow those crops. Oh yeah, you're eating somebody or something's poop when you're eating your food. Not directly. The chemicals have rearranged, but those nitrogen atoms in your body used to be poop. Yeah, there's actually, I was listening to a podcast a while back, and the title of the podcast was Poop Train. It was about how for a while, all the poop of New York City, nobody knew what to do with it. And some state, I think it was Colorado, was like, hey, we'll take it for our farms. And there was a train that carried a bunch of poop from New York City to Colorado to put on farms, and then everybody got to eat. I think they no longer do that much, and they use fertilizer more often than not. But hey, I like the poop train idea. Which brings us to our final topic, and kind of like with the carbon cycle, we can bring humans into the equation. Humans, with all our technology and stuff, we're constantly messing with these cycles, and the main way we mess with the nitrogen cycle is through making fertilizer. Humans a long time ago realized that the processes that make ammonia and soil nitrogen from the air, mainly bacterial, are too slow to basically grow enough crops to feed humanity. And so we came up with an artificial way to make ammonia out of air so that we could grow our crops. And so actually, I was saying that when you eat food, you're eating somebody else's pee or poop. If the farming is done the old-fashioned way with natural fertilizers, that could be the case. But typically, you are eating food grown using fertilizer, which is artificial pee and poop. Still kind of gross, but it's not quite that gross. All right, so we can put all this together and create our nitrogen cycle. We can start with the atmosphere, and we have N2 up here in the atmosphere, that triple bonded molecule, the one that's really hard to do anything with, and that's really tough molecule. And the only things that can really deal with it is the nitrogen fixating bacteria, and they can make it into ammonia, which is NH3 or NH4, depending on circumstances. And ammonia can be incorporated into protein in plants, and then animals can eat the plants, and sometimes the animals will pee and poop out, and that will put ammonia back into the soils. The only one I didn't really talk about was the denitrifying bacteria. There is another type of bacteria that can kind of complete this loop off, that can take ammonia and the energy in ammonia and burn it, and in the process release back into the atmosphere. So this kind of double loop looking thing is our basic nitrogen cycle. And once again, we're going to ask that question. Well, the nitrogen cycle, that's all kind of neat and interesting. It might give us a little perspective on Earth, where atoms in our body came from and things like that. And it's a little interesting to think about pee and poop and fertilizer and all that, but really doesn't matter. Yep, you guessed it, yes. And here, the place where it matters the most, I would say, is a concept called a dead zone, which happens in oceans. So let's watch a video about that.
A man-made phenomenon is threatening marine life in the Gulf of Mexico. The largest dead zone ever recorded in the U.S. has appeared at the mouth of the Mississippi River. It is primarily caused by fertilizer and sewage that wash off farmland in the river's watershed. Now, this runoff eventually makes its way to the sea, where it feeds algae blooms and bacteria that suck all the oxygen out of the water. Scientists announced this month the dead zone measures nearly 9,000 square miles. You think about that for a second. It's the same area as the state of New Jersey. Jeff Gore is in Dulac, Louisiana, with how this dead zone is impacting one of the largest seafood industries in the country. Jeff, good morning.
Gail, good morning to you. Unusually heavy rains in the Midwest this year resulted in more water in the Mississippi and then more water here in the Gulf, and that resulted in that biggest dead zone in history in the U.S., and that is difficult news for the fishermen who provide 40% of this nation's seafood.
Underwater video we recorded yesterday afternoon shows the transition from life to death as green fades to black. It becomes so dark, divers need flashlights to find their way around. Down here, there is almost no oxygen in the water, and this void stretches over an enormous portion of the Gulf.
This is the largest one we've ever measured and the second largest human-caused dead zone in the ocean.
Nancy Rabelais is the nation's foremost expert on dead zones. She's been measuring oxygen levels in the Gulf since 1985.
It's a feature that's large, it's not getting smaller, and attempts to manage the nutrients, nitrogen, particularly from the Mississippi River, are not having an effect on reducing the size.
Dead zones happen when agricultural runoff sends nitrogen-rich fertilizer downstream into the sea. The fertilizer feeds harmful amounts of algae at the surface that eventually die and sink to the bottom. Bacteria feast on the dead algae removing oxygen from the water, and fish, crabs, and shrimp are forced to leave or suffocate and die.
The solution lies upstream in the watershed with better agricultural management practices, a switch to crops that have deeper roots and don't need as much fertilizer and are still just as profitable as corn.
The water we watched them measure yesterday has less than half the oxygen needed to support basic fish life.
It's almost like a different planet.
It's yeah. If you're a scuba diver, you're used to having fish swimming all around you. From 30 to 60 feet, we won't see any fish.
Nothing.
Nothing.
These species of shrimp are not there like they used to be.
O'Neill John Sabin has been fishing these waters more than 40 years.
From a fishing perspective, you're talking about smaller shrimp or no shrimp at all.
Correct.
A study led by Duke University published this year found that dead zones in the Gulf do slow shrimp growth, resulting in higher prices for larger shrimp.
Do you see this issue getting better anytime soon?
Boy, I wish it would. I really do wish it would.
The EPA has set up a task force to look at dead zones. They are hoping to reduce nutrient-rich runoff by 20% by 2025. Nora?
So yeah, there's actually a lot of science to understand here. In dead zone creation and algae blooms are a result of both the nitrogen cycle and the carbon cycle. But this is our general process for how it happens. Basically, if we are using too much fertilizer in our farmland, and when it rains, some of it washes off into rivers. Also, if we have a lot of cows and pigs and chickens, all of which are pooping and peeing, sometimes all that stuff is flushed down the river as well, along with all of our human poo and pee. And all of that contributes a lot of nitrogen to this water. And all of this river water will eventually flow down to lakes and to the ocean. And all of this nitrogen that's in the river water that came from our fertilizer and poo and pee is amazing food for algae. And algae is kind of like a plant that is, free floating in the ocean. And so it's basically free plant food for them. And they grow like crazy to the point where they will become so abundant that they can actually block out a bit of the sun. So up here, there's so much algae up here that not much sunlight can actually even make it down to the bottom, so that can kill things. But more importantly, eventually this algae will run out of nitrogen and begin dying and falling to the bottom of the ocean. And in the process, it begins to rot and decompose, which takes all of the oxygen. So all of the oxygen that's in the water is used up through the process of cellular respiration and decomposition. So the amount of oxygen in the water goes down, and the amount of carbon dioxide in the water goes up, making the water more acidic. And this combination of chemistry happening in the water basically ends up killing everything. So all the fish die and all the plants die and everything dies. And this all has to do with the nitrogen cycle being thrown out of balance. All this stuff is really, really important in the world. And most people don't realize any of it's happening. And this is one of those subjects when we're talking about the chemistry of Earth, where once you build that foundational knowledge and understand it, you start seeing all kinds of problems with how humans are kind of treating the planet and some of our effects on the world. I will leave you with one last kind of interesting and cool thought. We've been talking about how all of these atoms are moving in and out of our body. So for example, if you eat protein and it gets incorporated into a muscle, it'll be there for quite some time. The atoms in that protein will be there for some time, weeks, months, maybe even years. But eventually it'll break down and you pee or poop it out. And that goes with pretty much every atom in your body. And so the thought experiment that you can do with this is, because of these processes that are happening, if you close your eyes and you think back to a moment of your childhood and you have a very distinct memory of it, what's going on, maybe you can remember smells or sights or sounds or any of that stuff, not a single atom in your body is the same today as it was back then. So you don't have a single atom in your body right now that was the same as when you were a child. That's how many atoms come and go from your body all the time. And so your body is constantly being reworked and remade out of all these recycled goods. And the old atoms that you're breathing out or peeing out, they're being reworked into the world, into trees, into new plants, new crops, new animals, new soils, new rocks. Whether you like it or not, you are just part of this planet. It's kind of an interesting thought. So I'll leave you with that. Take it easy. Yeah, when you start thinking this way, you start having some strange thoughts. One last postscript. Let me drink some of this water here that I got from the water fountain here at school. All right, so this is tap water in the city of Houston. That tap water comes from 3 lakes in our area, Lake Livingston, Lake Conroe, or Lake Houston. One of those 3 lakes is what we get our tap water from, and it's distributed all through the pipes of Houston. Water got in those lakes coming down the river from the rainfall that's falling through Texas over Texas. That rainfall is typically made over the Gulf of Mexico from evaporation of that big body of water heating up, creating rain clouds that come over Texas and rain down. And so those molecules of water probably came from the Gulf of Mexico. One of the bodies of water that fed into the Gulf of Mexico is my local bayou system, Brays Bayou and the Ship Channel that feed into Galveston Bay. A few years ago, I was living in Houston, and this is so gross. I used the bathroom here at the toilet of Westbury, and flushed the toilet, and the water went into the sewer and then down to the Brays Bayou water treatment facility to get processed before being released into Brays Bayou. And wait a minute, my pee molecules, the water in my pee, went down in the bayou, went to the ocean, evaporation, fell back down as rain, landed in the lake, was reprocessed. I guarantee you right now, some of these molecules of water, and there's trillions of them in here, 100% chance that previously they were in my pee. So you don't have to be Bear Grylls to drink your own pee. You're doing it every day. Peace.